Thank you. Oh, for God's sake.
Yeah. Okay.
There you go. Now, there you go. Press that one. There you go.
Stop wiggling.
All right.
Look at that.
There you go. Who said he couldn't figure his own material out? Tonight is the story of the prelude to D-Day. It is not the story of D-Day. So what I'm going to start with is Ambrose's book, D-Day. That's the book I've been working with, and it is subtitled The Climatic Battle of World War II, which, by the way, it was not. The climatic battle of World War II, as far as I'm concerned, was a battle I'm going to talk about in the middle of this program. But the book describes the preparations for D-Day in very great detail. Talks a lot about how they chose to go where they chose. Talks about the dates of the landing, because that was a big deal. And it talks about the planning and training that the troops went through, and the embarkation itself, which happened 6 days before the actual landing. And in the next program, I'll talk about the assault itself. Ambrose was one of the first historians to use the stories of participants to frame his subject. Now, there are a lot of people that do that now, but Ambrose, back in the time that he was writing these books, like the Band of Brothers, was one of the first people who really went into using the stories of participants. The book also focuses on the battle in the political arena, both in the Allied and German arenas. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about both of them, because that had a lot to do with what actually happened on the battlefield. Ambrose acknowledges that it wasn't the battle that won the war, but he says that without it, the map of Europe might be different today. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that might be true. Had we not landed and started the second front, what would have happened between Hitler and Stalin would have probably been different than it turned out to be. And then the invasion itself will be part 2 of the program. And I'm nowhere near ready to do part 2. I've got just a very few pages of it done, so it'll be sometime in May. Now, what was World War before D-Day? World War I, which really, World War II was nothing but a continuation of World War I. It started as a war of movement. It did not start as the way we think of it on the Western Front. The Germans invaded the same way they invaded in 1939. And then it became a stagnation and attrition war. All sides came to understand they did not want to repeat that. The First World War saw the birth of aviation, of tanks, of defensive strategies, but it ended as the war to end all wars, which, as we know, is not what happened. 20 years later, World War II began with Lightning War, Blitzkrieg, which was focused on speed of movement, and the German army was successful because of how well it utilized the combination of infantry, aviation, and tanks, armored vehicles. So the German success really happened because of how well they dealt with the speed of the activities that they were doing. By late 1942, the Nazi Empire was at its greatest expanse. Hitler reigned over most of Europe, a fairly sizable portion of what we think of as Asia and a fair amount of North Africa. They had a very large area that they had control over. And a lot of people think too large an area. Hitler couldn't control all of the lands that he had. In the east, this is Russia, the tide turned to Stalingrad. Then the Africa Corps surrendered in Tunisia, and Italy was invaded. And all of a sudden, German strategy became protect. They were no longer thinking, functioning, capable of lightning war. The war was back to being a war of stagnation. And that's what happened up until the D-Day that we're going to talk about. Now, I want to talk about a battle that I talked about in an earlier talk called the Battle of Kursk. And you see on the left who was involved in the battle. It actually had two phases. One was the German attack called Operation Citadel, and you see how big it was. We're talking 1 million men against 2 million men, literally thousands and thousands of tanks and armored guns. The initial attack stalled, and the Soviet counteroffensive began with an even larger number of people, more men and more tanks. It was fought around the city of Kursk, which is 280 miles southwest of Moscow, in July of 1943. And if there was one single place where I think of the turning point of the Second World War, it was Kursk. It began with the German launch of Citadel, as I said, and the intent was to pinch off a very sizable portion of the Soviet army in what was called the Kursk salient. At the time, the Germans were still mobile, and they were attacking from the north and from the south simultaneously. It was the largest tank battle ever fought. It was 5 times the Battle of the Bulge. In 3 weeks, the Germans suffered 400,000 casualties, and the Russians suffered 800,000 casualties. The Soviet army was victorious because of their defense in depth, and I'm going to come back to that. So they didn't try to defeat the Germans at the points of attack. They had depth, they had defenses in depth, and eventually the Blitzkrieg attack ran out of gas, literally. It was the last strategic offensive the Germans ever launched on the Eastern Front. Now, here's a statistic that matters a lot. More than 4,000 German tanks and armored guns were either destroyed or badly damaged at Kursk. That was about 1/3 of their total armored capability lost in that one battle. Now I want to talk a little bit about the commanders. Dwight Eisenhower, born in Kansas in 1890. He graduated from West Point in 1915, very much in the middle of his class. Eisenhower was not someone that looked like what he became later on. He didn't serve at all in World War I. His capabilities started to show up at Command and General Staff School in 1925. He graduated first in his class. And to come from the middle of his class at the military academy to first in his class said that there was something special about this guy. He served twice under MacArthur. They were not good friends, and I could tell you some jokes about him and MacArthur. MacArthur said that Eisenhower was the best damn clerk he ever had. Eisenhower said that he took acting from a master. They were not great friends. By the outbreak of World War II, Dwight Eisenhower was a battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel. 2 years later, He was commander of the invasion of North Africa. So, and there are people who wonder how in the world the lieutenant colonel goes from that posture to being a lieutenant general in 2 years. Eisenhower had a great person looking out for him named George Marshall. By December of 43, he was the supreme commander of Overlord. Now, on the other side, Erwin Rommel was born near Ulm, Germany in 1891, 1 year younger than Eisenhower. Rommel attended officer cadet school and graduated in 1911. In World War I, he led troops in combat in several different theaters, and he was very, very effective at it. So he started making his name known in World War I. Between the wars, he supported Hitler. He rose in rank to that of battalion commander, and then he was promoted to Major General in 1939. He was a successful division commander in the invasion of the Low Countries. So now back to Blitzkrieg and Lightning War. He was a division commander in the original invasion of France. He then became Africa Corps commander in 1942. By 44, he was an Army group commander. He was a field marshal by then. He was responsible for both the 7th and 15th Armies. One of those armies is the army at Normandy. Now, the command roles, and this is really important. Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander. Supreme. He had authority for all the Allied ground forces. He had authority for all the Allied naval forces. He had authority for the Air Force, their assets and their focus. Eisenhower was in charge of the invasion, and there was nobody else that he had to listen to other than he took his direction from Marshall and Churchill. Montgomery, who you see in the picture, Field Marshal Montgomery was responsible for the ground forces in Overlord. On the other hand, Rommel was specifically responsible just for the defense of a sector of the French coast. He had command of 2 armies. He had command of 3 tank divisions in those 2 armies, but only one was close to the coast. Von Rundstedt, in the middle, was responsible for the defense of the entire West Wall. Hitler maintained responsibility for the whole Panzer Reserves and for the Luftwaffe. So Rommel and Rundstedt, even though they had responsibility for the West Wall coast, they did not have accountability for what to do with the tank reserves. Neither did they have authority to coordinate Luftwaffe actions. They differed very widely in what they thought should be done in the strategy of defend at the beaches or defend in depth. And they also differed in how to use the resources that they had. And that was one of the serious problems in the German defense of Normandy. There was not agreement in the command structure about how to go about doing that. Now, the Germans were faced with some serious strategic challenges. They had 2,000 miles of coastline to defend, and their strategy was complicated by 4 factors. Where was the invasion likely to strike? And knowing what we know now, we know the answer. They most definitely did not. The bigger question was whether to defend at the beach or defend in depth. There were 50 divisions in France and the surrounding Low Countries, and 10 armored divisions in France. Where do you put them? They were also limited by resources. What could they spare from the East Front, especially Panzer units? And after Kursk, these Panzer divisions were badly impaired. And then the final factor is, what infantry forces should be allocated to the West Wall? The Russians were now moving towards Germany. How much infantry do you leave on the West Wall? And those all complicated how they allocated resources and what their plans were. They knew invasion was coming. The choice that they made was to do all of the above. They staffed the West Wall with a combination of foreign troops. They were busy refitting Panzer units, and they had a cadre of veteran Wehrmacht forces. Most of the German divisions that were in France were not the same kind of divisions that they had invaded France with 4 years earlier. Now, this is a kind of a sideline, but it was the initial effort to breach the wall. It was called the Diep Raid. In August of 42, the British decided to test the water of the West Wall. 6,000 British commandos, primarily Canadians, raided a village called Dieppe on the northwest coast of France. And what they wanted to find out was, what was it going to take to bring troops in and put them in place and look for ways of expanding into France. In 6 hours, this raid suffered 50% casualties. It accomplished almost nothing. It could not even get through the town where they invaded. Part of the problem was they were not ready for urban fighting. The Diep Raid was one of the factors in Churchill's reluctance to attack the West Wall, and he really was not in favor of Overlord. Notably, around the Dieppe Raid, the RAF was decimated. It was unable to support the raid effectively. The German at that time, the German Luftwaffe, was much stronger and was able to neutralize the RAF support. It provided many learnings for the Overlord planning, but many of them was what not to do. And the biggest one was, do not get caught in urban areas. And the later Overlord plans, as you'll see throughout this, were to attack the little towns and the beaches where there were no towns at all. Now, dress rehearsals for Overlord. The first one was North Africa, Operation Torch in 1942. Strategically, this invasion was a compromise. Marshall wanted this operation to go into France, but the British said, we're no way ready to go into France. And because of their demands, instead they went to North Africa, along in here. 100,000 Americans landed in North Africa against 125,000 Vichy French. North Africa was not held by the Germans. In that area, it was held by the French. 3 separate landing forces encountered light resistance and minimum casualties. You could really call this a dress rehearsal. The Vichy forces capitulated. So Operation Torch was a very easy success, and they learned a fair amount from it. The next invasion was Italy, which started with an invasion of Sicily. There were 2 units in that. This was started in the fall of 43. And again, Churchill did not want to invade France in 43. 2 units, the 82nd Airborne and the 1st Infantry Division, were going to be moved back around to England to be part of the invasion at Overlord. This invasion was also a compromise. Churchill continued to use his soft underbelly thesis. That was the proper next step. Capture Italy before you try to take France. 3 divisions without airborne participation landed with significant opposition in Italy. They learned many lessons in that landing that they could then reapply to Overlord. The Italian campaign eventually forced Italy out of the war, but they never captured Italy. The Germans never surrendered Italy. When the war ended, the German army was still in Italy, still had control of the northern part of the country. Meanwhile, planning for the invasion that eventually became Overlord, started with something called Operation Bolero in 1942. It began in May. The target date in Overlord initially was called Roundup, was April of 1943. And the strategic planning was to transport, house, and train 1 million American troops in England. 500,000 ground troops, 240,000 Air Force, and 235 from the services of supply. Think of them as logistics. And this does not count Navy forces. So they saw from the very beginning, if they were going to successfully invade France, they needed a very, very large military force. Air Force buildup by March of 43 would be 3,600 aircraft. The 8th Air Force would have 800 heavy bombers, 600 medium bombers, 340 light bombers, and 1,000 fighters. So they saw at the very beginning that in order to make Bolero successful, what began Roundup and what eventually became Overlord, they were going to need air supremacy, not just air equality. Churchill was reluctant in 42. He was more interested in protecting the empire, which he saw as the Mediterranean. His focus became Italy. The original plan for Overlord was to land 3 divisions on 4 beaches. That plan obviously grew before Overlord actually was taking place. The plan continued to grow larger. Eventually, it included 1.2 million men and much wider. A 5th beach was added. The airborne units were added over the 2-year time frame between the time it started in May of 42 and when it actually took place in June of 44. A major limitation was landing craft availability. Now remember, landing craft had to be in the Mediterranean for all of those landings. Landing craft were required in the Pacific. By then, we were landing Marines in the Pacific. And then the second limitation was training needed to prepare the assault force. I want to talk a little bit about landing craft. Here's what they used. Up in the upper left, you see the landing craft personnel, LCPs. But the LCPs were just for the infantry. They also had bigger landing craft infantries, LCIs. They carried a half a battalion. Landing craft tanks, carrying up to 9 tanks, and then landing ship tanks, which could carry 32 medium tanks. Adequate ships and boats to support the landing. And I wish Bill was here because I'm not sure I understand the difference between a ship and a boat. But ships and boats were critical to the success of Overlord. American production with British supplementation produced an incredible armada of ships and boats. Now I'm going to digress again and tell you a little bit about Andrew Higgins. He was born in Nebraska in 1886. His original company was a small boat manufacturing business in New Orleans. It became one of the biggest industries in the world. He based his designs. He was building landing craft primarily on boats that were made for operating in swamps and marshes, flat bottoms. Higgins Industries had 80,000 workers in and around the Louisiana area. Government contracts worth $350 million, or today $5 billion in contracts. He built more than 23,000 boats, primarily made of mahogany and plywood. He held 30 patents, mostly covering amphibious landing craft. And he died in 1952 a pauper because by the end of the war he had overextended himself. He made a number of bad choices in the late 40s and his business collapsed. Now back to Overlord, the selection of landing sites. You might have heard the term Fortress Europe. It was a term the Nazis coined as propaganda. Hitler's plan was to fortify all of occupied Europe to prevent invasion from the British Isles. That's what Fortress Europe was about. As I said earlier, Germany had 2,000 miles of coastline, garrisons in Norway. There were 14 divisions in Norway, all the way down through France, over 50 divisions. There were 3 areas seriously considered for Overlord. The first one was the Pas-de-Calais. That was the shortest distance to cross here. It's only about 30 miles across the channel there. The second one was the Mediterranean coast of France. They already had 4 seaborne invasions in France, and they thought about coming up here, coming up through southern France as their invasion route. And then the third one was called the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. The criteria, which one of these 3 makes the most sense, was simple. The first one was proximity to air cover. Their air cover was in the United Kingdom or in Africa. The second one was they needed a seaport for logistical support. The third one was proximity to the ultimate objective. That was Germany. What was the quickest way to get to Germany? Finally, Normandy was chosen, not because it met the criteria the best, but because this area was the most heavily fortified, the Pas-de-Calais. So they chose Normandy out of those 3. I want to talk about the Luftwaffe at D-Day because this is really important. In early 44, 6 months before Overlord, Germany had assembled a bomber flotilla of more than 500 bombers. They were brought into France to bomb the Allied invasion fleet. There were Junkers 188s primarily and some of the other German bombers. At Hitler's insistence, now this is back to who's controlling what part of the military forces, instead of being held back for Overlord, these planes conducted an attack on England as part of something that Hitler and his staff called Operation Steinbock. And what it was revenge for the Allied bombing of Germany, which was going on at the same time. Operation Steinbock targeted southern England from January to May of 1944. It was nighttime, low-level bombing, and it did achieve some small results. However, coupled with anti-aircraft fire, the British Mosquito was the primary night fighter defense against the Steinbock. And 90% of the bombers and fighters in this flotilla were lost in these attacks. According to the statistics that I've read, and it's almost hard to believe them, mosquito losses were very low. It was a very good fighter aircraft. By June 44, cumulative fighter and bomber losses, especially of unit leaders, left the Luftwaffe a spent force. And here's another little piece of information that you might not have ever heard of. It had no Messerschmitt 262s, which might have made a difference. So I thought I'd tell you about the Messerschmitt 262. Look at this aircraft, maximum speed of 560 miles an hour. Armament, 4 30-millimeter cannon. If that plane had been available, and there's no good reason why it wasn't, except for Hitler, Overlord might have had a bigger struggle in its attack. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, far and away the best fighter of World War II. Design work on this plane actually started before the war, and they had problems with it. They had problems with the engine, they had problems with metallurgy, but the biggest problems they had was top-level interference with the project. It kept the aircraft from operational status with the Luftwaffe until around the time of Overlord. Luftwaffe command wanted to make the plane a top priority, but Hitler was more interested in the V weapons development. And so when you looked at their technical development program, the V1 and V2 got a lot more energy than the Messerschmitt 262 and got the materials that were needed. It was faster and more heavily armed than any Allied fighter. It was the most advanced airplane during World War II. Throughout the war, they produced 1,400 of these 262s, but a maximum of 200 were operational at any one time. In the air, there was no Allied airplane that could touch it. So what they learned to do was try to attack the 262s on the ground. Had it been available earlier, Allied air supremacy at D-Day would have been challenged. And here's a single, for instance, one single Me-262 pilot shot down 10 P-51s later on in the war. And the P-51 was the most effective plane the Allies had. There just was no Allied fighter to compete with the 262. Now, Allied air power, on the other hand, by the spring of '44, Allied air had reached air supremacy. There were more than 4,000 bombers, fighters, and transport planes aggregated in England to support the invasion. The airplane campaign itself had 3 stages. The first one was disable the Luftwaffe. Told you a little bit about how that happened. The second one was cut off main supply access routes. And finally, once the invasion began, focus on battlefield interdiction and close air support. On the other hand, Bomber Command did not want to do that. Bomber Command wanted to continue the focus on the German heartland. They were convinced that the way to defeat the Germans was to destroy their will to fight and destroy their industrial capacity. Ike wanted to focus on France and transportation interdiction. Remember, Ike was in charge of the Air Force. Ike won, and they did what he wanted. The specific goal of Overlord was the destruction of French rail communications, especially rail lines leading towards the beach areas. So Eisenhower was able to take this sizable Air Force and focus it on preparing to support his landing instead of trying to defeat Germany strategically. Now, a little bit of information about training. Of the American landing troops, remember there was 500,000 of them eventually, only 2 divisions, the 82nd Airborne and the 1st Infantry, were battle hardened. All the rest of them were recruits. The majority of the landing force were young, unproven soldiers and sailors, primarily draftees. Experienced NCOs were in short supply. Almost a fourth of the landing force, and I did not know this, but I'm not totally surprised, were combat engineers. So of that 150,000 who landed day one, 40,000 of them were engineers. These engineers spent months training with explosives, clearing mines, clearing access roads, mastering the beaches, controlling the beach logistical flow, and much more. The combat engineers made a great deal of difference on D-Day. Now that's being said without a bias as a combat engineer. Infantry units spent months on small unit tactics, movement, and command and control. The only thing they weren't ready for was as they moved inland, they were not ready for the hedgerows, and they were a problem. The Rangers practiced their special techniques for the Pont de Hoc. You've probably seen a lot of that in D-Day, the 6th of June movie. But they practiced and practiced and practiced how they were going to capture that, because the expectation was the Pont de Hoc had a sizable number of large cannon. As it turned out, they weren't there, but they didn't know that. Each unit, as they were training, had detailed pictures of their particular area. They had sand tables of their landing area, what to expect as they came ashore. They even made one large 3-dimensional model of Omaha Beach so you could tell where everything was on Omaha Beach back in your training area. The control and operation of the landing craft, remember that little detail, required countless hours of practice. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the landing practices. You ever heard of Exercise Tiger? The Army and the Navy used a place called Slapton Sands in Devon in April of '44 to practice the Normandy landings. This rehearsal involved as many as 30,000 troops landing at one time. The first practice assault was on the morning of 27 April. They were using live ammunition. They had moved the people away from the impact area. And the naval bombardment was to precede the landing. Due to a mix-up in communications, the seaborne troops came under friendly fire, and as many as 300 Americans were killed in this practice, one of the more serious friendly fire incidents of the war, and it got worse. The next day, 28 April, the convoy for the rehearsal was attacked in the bay by heavily armed fast-attack E-boats, resulting in another 600 Navy and Army dead or missing. And on the right, you see a picture of what an E-boat looked like. An E-boat was considerably larger than a PT boat, much faster, had a larger crew. It was also more heavily armed. One of the questions that came up later on about D-Day itself is why didn't the Germans use their E-boats? And there isn't a very good answer for that. An E-boat was larger, faster, and more heavily armed than a PT boat, as I said. The disaster itself was hushed up. The truth was only revealed 40 years later when the Sherman tank that you see on the right was raised from the seabed. So that error, which cost 700 and something men, was hushed up. Now, I want to talk a little bit about deceptions, and I want to start with the one up here towards Norway. It was called Fortitude North, and the Brits put out a variety of information implying that they were going to invade Norway first. That's why the Germans kept in place the 14 divisions that I talked about earlier. The concentration of men and material in England in 43 and 44 made it obvious that the invasion was imminent. Now the question was where. And so they started a second deception campaign. It was called Fortitude South. It was the primary deception of Overlord. The intention was to convince the Nazis that the invasion would occur here at the Pas-de-Calais, which was the closest coastline to England. They used fake radio transmissions. They planted double agents. They even assembled a phantom army down around Dover, commanded by George Patton, to deceive the Germans. As the real invasion occurred, the Germans were still convinced that the Pas-de-Calais was the intended landing site. 22 divisions were stationed in that area, and they were not released until 2 weeks after D-Day. The Germans were convinced that what was happening at Normandy was a feint. Southwick House. This is a place we went to on our Band of Brothers tour. It was the nerve center for Overlord. It was in Portsmouth, which is a port on the south of England. It was the headquarters of the Allied commanders, Ramsay, Eisenhower, Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory, and General Montgomery. What you see on the right is a wooden map. That wooden map is still there. We got to see that map. And this was before the day of computer simulations and all the rest of that. This is all made out of wood, but it illustrated the plan for D-Day landings. For security, the map maker had been instructed to create a map with all of Britain and Ireland and all of the Atlantic seaboard, from the northern part of Norway to the Pyrenees. The original map that was built for this area. This map is the size of a wall, maybe 12 feet high and 30 feet wide. It was a major show and tell piece of propaganda. Visiting dignitaries would be brought here by Eisenhower or one of his staff, and they were shown this is what Overlord is going to look like. It's still there. I mean, it's just a piece of history. It's what, 80 something years old? It's really an interesting place. The final D-Day plan. 600,000 men were concentrated here in southeastern England and in Ireland. 165,000 would land on D-Day. The sea invasion would be preceded by 3 airborne divisions, and the airborne divisions actually passed east of the peninsula, so they were out here so as not to be observed. And then what happened was they turned east, came in over the peninsula, and they were to be behind the Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. The British airborne came this way to be behind the British landing zones. The air cover was to be 3,600 planes. 5,300 ships and boats were involved in this flotilla. I mean, there were just boats you could almost walk from one to the next one. The loading itself began on May the 31st. That's a very important date, because they knew there was a brief period of time when the high tides here in Normandy would actually support such an effort. They needed the high tides to be able to start unloading, not just the landing itself, because they did not land at high tide, but they needed the high tides for logistical support. Meanwhile, the German troops in France trained very little. They were not mobile forces. They relied on fixed defenses, concrete and steel. The German generals were convinced, now this is in late May, even early June, the bad weather would delay the invasion. Their weather forecasts predicted storms throughout the entire high tide period, and they knew high tide was necessary too. Rommel even returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. His wife's birthday was the 6th of June. Many of the local commanders were at a map conference in Rennes, France. So they weren't at their division, corps, and whatnot posts either. One general, this general here, whose name was Marx, he was the commanding general of the 84th Corps, expected the Allies to land on the 6th of June, and he expected them to land in Normandy. He was a voice in the wilderness. Loading. First thing you have to do is you have to take these 500,000 men and congregate them at the ports of debarkation. The movement of this many men and their equipment was a logistical feat that just rivaled the landing itself in complexity. As these forces were congregating, they ran out of things to do. All they really had to do was eat, play poker, and very little else. They were given pep talks. They were given sermons. They were even given communion. And they were given a lot of cigarettes. Cigarettes were considered the thing to have when you went into the country. You could use them for barter, trade, whatever you want to call it. The loading began the 31st, and almost immediately, most of these ships were overloaded. The Armada was now poised, but it could not remain in this state of readiness for very long. Last-minute jitters. Eisenhower asked for de Gaulle's cooperation. What he wanted to do was print French money and issue it to the troops. De Gaulle said no. De Gaulle said the only person that has authority to speak for France was him, and he did not give his permission. So they did it anyway. Churchill wanted to go. Came to Eisenhower and he said, I want to go on the invasion. Eisenhower said, no, we can't afford to let you go, Prime Minister. Churchill said, some of those ships are English ships. You can't keep me off of an English ship. So then what happened was Eisenhower's chief of staff called the king and said, please stop Churchill from going on the invasion. So the king got in touch with Churchill and he said, if you're going, Winston, I'm going with you. At that time, Winston chose not to go. At the end of May, Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory, he was the air commander who worked for Eisenhower. He came to Ike with one last-minute protest, and it was formal in writing. The Germans had just inserted a 91st Division where the airborne drop zones were planned. He predicted 50% casualties in the airborne units. He recommended that the airborne assault be canceled. Eisenhower actually took his approach pretty seriously, went back and thought about why he was using the airborne troops, what their functions were going to be. He realized that if he disregarded Lee Mallory's recommendation and he was wrong, he would have an unbearable burden of dead, wounded men on his conscience. He then wrote to Lee Mallory after much soul searching, there is nothing for it but to go. June the 4th, the weather was the key. There was a large storm in the area in early June. That storm would have kept the air cover from doing what it had to do. And Eisenhower was very much concerned about having those troops out there without the air cover that he had in line. The boats were loaded. They had been for 3 days, and they were actually away from the quayside, and the weather forecast was not good. By the 4th, the ships themselves were running out of food and fuel. If they did not go forward, they were going to have to return to base, refuel, and reprovision. At 21:30 on the 4th, the weather forecast informed the Allied Expeditionary Force High Command there would be a 24 to 36 hour break in the storm. The leadership was split. The Navy and the Air Force suggested they delay 2 weeks. The ground commander, Montgomery, voted to go. So Eisenhower's leadership was split. Eisenhower decided to go, and the convoys began to form at midnight on the 4th. The assault would be at 6 a.m. on the 6th, to be preceded by the airborne the night before. Ike even wrote a letter. He never published it, never released it, that he was alone responsible for the failure. Preliminary conclusions. By the late spring of 1944, the German army in France was not the army of Blitzkrieg. Many of the forces were non-German. There were prisoners from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, Russia, even as far away as Japan. They were not motivated to fight. However, physically, their wall was formidable. Russia had been demanding a second front for 2 years. Germany's only hope, without the second front, was that Russia would break its alliance. Stalin was never real strongly attached to America and Great Britain. As far as he was concerned, they were a convenience. And if they weren't going to do what he wanted, the risk was that he and Hitler would make an agreement, and that would then put America and Great Britain in a bind. Von Rundstedt, who was the commander-in-chief of the army, was tired, and he was ready to quit. Rommel, commander of Army Group B, no longer believed that victory was possible. And finally, the decision to go was Eisenhower's burden. The buck stopped with him. So now you know about Overlord. Anybody still there?
George, in the movie of D-Day, they suggested that